So our next presenter this afternoon, Jocelyn Dubuc, and again, Jocelyn is from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine in the University of Montreal.
All right, thank you. I just want to acknowledge that this work was done by one of my graduate students, Nasera Tazurut. She couldn't make it here, but I'll be presenting today. So when we talk about mycotoxins, basically these toxins are made by molds or fungi, and in our part of the world, in Canada, or at least in eastern Canada, the two ones that we most commonly find is deoxynivalenol, or DON, because it's easier to pronounce, and zearalenone, or ZEN. And these two are the most commonly found in our context. That might not be true for everywhere, but that's what we have in our context. From a field perspective, or a veterinarian field perspective, there's a discrepancy between what we find in the literature and what we live in real life. In the literature, there are a bunch of studies looking at acute high-dose intoxication of mycotoxins, especially for DON, but also for ZEN. They've shown that giving acute high dose of them will cause problems with reproduction and health. Unfortunately, on the field, what we deal with is more what I would call chronic low-dose exposition. So on a daily basis for quite a long time, might be weeks, months, years, these cows are exposed to lower dose of mycotoxins, and that may cause some problem. But there's really little or no data to support what is the concentration that gets in trouble. In our part of the world, the dairy nutritionists recommend to aim for less than 1 ppm, 1 parts per million of DON in the total ration to avoid having these problems. But really, when you start digging in the literature, what you find is pretty much nothing. This idea of the 1 ppm is not really supported. So that's what led to our research objectives, which were to first quantify DON and ZEN in feed, blood, and urine in dairy cows, and then trying to identify at which concentration these mycotoxins could be associated with disease occurrence and reproductive problems later on. So what we've done is a 1-year prospective cohort study where we enrolled 38 commercial dairy farms. In each farms, we took the 12 freshest cows at the moment of sampling, and we followed them for 300 days. These farms were convenient sampling. Basically, they were within 2 hours of driving of the ambulatory clinic and from the university, and they had to be willing to participate, of course. They needed to have computerized and good computerized records, and to be not to use antitoxin in their feed. What we did, these herds were visited frequently by our research technician, and we took feed, blood, and urine samples of all the cows enrolled, and we sampled. These samples were tested for DON, but also its metabolite, DOM1, in blood. And then it was also tested for ZEN and its metabolite in urine, alpha-ZEN and beta-ZEN. As far as disease and reproduction, the conditions we looked at, so we followed these cows for 300 days in milk, or 300 days, I should say, and we look at different conditions. We looked at hyperketonemia and purulent vaginal discharge. You have to know that all these herds were on systematic diagnostic protocols. So they were all systematically sampling for hyperketonemia and PVD. So we could rely on these data pretty good. We also looked at culling, abortion, and time to pregnancy as a matter of reproductive performance. As far as statistical analyses, what we've done is basically 2 major steps. The first step was univariable association using 2x2 tables. Basically, what we were looking at is what is the optimal cutoff of mycotoxin concentration that would lead to the highest sum of sensitivity and specificity. And once we found those optimal cutoffs, then we went to a second step where we did multivariable logistic regression for disease and survival analysis for reproduction. To give you an idea of these cutoffs, there's a bunch of numbers in this table, and there's more than I'm going to talk about it today. But the idea here is all these cutoffs, these are the ones, we tested a bunch of them, right? Many disease, many mycotoxins, many fluid or feed. So in the end, these are the ones that we retain, and these are the ones that had the highest sum of sensitivity and specificity. Why did we choose that? Multiple ways to do it, I guess. Highest sum of sensitivity and specificity leads to the lowest proportion of false positive and false negative, and so we assume that could be a good way to be as accurate as possible. So to give you an idea, in hyperketonemia, the threshold that was, or the cutoff that was used was in feed, concentration of Zn, 0.09 ppb, parts per billion, or greater was the cutoff. And then you have all these other cutoffs here for information. Let's be more practical. Let's look more at what it means for cows. Here's the condition of purulent vaginal discharge. So basically, coming out of the final model, what it shows is that cows that were fed or ingested DON concentration of 3.21 ppm or greater, these cows had 1.9 times the odds of having PVD, or purulent vaginal discharge, than cows fed lower concentration of DON. And so it increased the risk, and that's very interesting. What does that mean from, even more practical? Well, here's the histogram of the least square means of this model. And what you find is that it is stratified by the DON concentration in feed. So lower concentration at 3 ppm or greater concentration at greater or equal to 3.21 ppm. And what you see here in the y-axis is the prevalence of PVD. And so we see that when the DON in feed was higher, the prevalence of PVD was higher. And so that's interesting. About abortion, that's another one we looked at. And similarly, DON in feed was a predictor and was associated. So cows that were fed or ingested 6.74 ppm of DON had 3.7 times the odds of having abortion in their 300 following days, or basically their lactation, compared to cows fed lower DON. Again here, it increased the risk of abortion, and what we find is that we were talking about 3 ppm for the other condition, purulent vaginal discharge. Here we're at about 6 ppm. Least square means here, what do they mean? Same graph, stratified by DON concentration, prevalence of abortion in the y-axis. What you see is that cows, in our study population, cows that were at high level of DON, so almost 7 ppm or more, fed chronically, almost 25% of these cows aborted in their lactation. So there was not a ton of these cows. I think it was 50. I had the numbers previously. But the idea is the risk is much increased in this population of cows. How about culling? Well, we looked at cows that had in their urine beta-Zn concentration of 6.23 ppb or greater were 2.4 times more likely to have to be in cull in that lactation or so. And again, what it means from a practical point of view is that cows with high beta-Zn in their urine were almost 45% cows. Sorry, 45% of these cows had been culled during the duration study, which is much higher than the remaining of the cows, which was around 25%. How about repro? What does it mean? There's a lot of evidence of high dose of Zn that will be bad for reproduction. Well, in this case, the threshold that we use, or the cutoff, was 2.70 ppb of Zn in the urine. And we did survival analysis, and we could look at a bunch of different things, hazard ratio, but I thought this graph could show more what we're looking at from a practitioner's point of view. For those unfamiliar with this graph, here's the days in milk of all these cows and the proportion of cows open here. So basically, all the cows are open starting at calving until the end of the voluntary waiting period. Once the voluntary waiting period is over, cows are bred, and then some of them become pregnant. If there is less cows open, this line will drop, all right? So blue and red means they're stratified by the concentration in the urine. Blue is low concentration, red is high concentration. And basically what it means is the faster you drop this line of open cows, it means more cows are getting pregnant, all right? So the desirable thing is to have this line drop as fast as possible. Another way to look at it that would be speaking more to practitioners would be how long do these cohort takes to get half of their population pregnant? So that's one way to look at it. Well, in the case of low concentration of Zen in their urine, these cows took about less than 100 days to become pregnant. Whereas the cows that were high concentration in their urine, they took around 165 days to become pregnant. So there's quite a difference in days open in these two cow population. Again, showing that having higher zearalenone concentration in your urine for these cows was associated with something not desirable for reproduction. All right. In conclusion, like we thought, we were able to identify some mycotoxins concentration threshold to identify cows at greater risk of disease or poorer reproduction. One of the take-home message that we got out of this project, which was wider than just this presentation, but is if you're looking for DON, which is mainly what we do in our country or in Eastern Canada, DON, you should look at it in the feed. If you're looking at it in the blood, that's no good. You should look at DOM1, but there was no association between these predictors. So really, DON in the feed, we're talking about 3 to 6 ppm as threshold for having to be more likely to have disease or poor conditions. This is much higher than the 1 ppm that is currently recommended. So in our context. And so we should think about it. The other part of it is Zen, you should look at it in urine. And so basically the threshold will change, but if you're zearalenone looking at it, we're looking at it in urine. I have to keep in mind that this is epidemiological study, so we showed association but not causality, and further step will be to look at causality in here. But in the meantime, it should help veterinarians, nutritionists, and producers to manage their herds. I'd like to acknowledge the funding from our Ministry of Agriculture in our province and from the farmers and technical support for the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, for a very interesting presentation. And again, we do have some time for some questions. So again, we have people with microphones, so close to the front here. If we could have a microphone close to the front, please, on the center aisle. And we have another one at the very back as well on the center aisle, please. So we'll take the question closest to the front first. Okay, so if
Yes, my name is Menno Holtzhauer from the Dutch Animal Health Service. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Have you looked at the feed intake, the amount of feed intake? This, of course, we know that feed with the mycotoxins might be less tasty, for example. And that may be related also to your problems.
So the question was about, did we measure feed intake? We didn't, because we were in commercial dairy farms, so we had a rough idea of what was the dry matter intake of the cows based on what they feed, but we didn't have exact measures, so no, I don't have that information.
Okay. We have a question in the center, and can we get a microphone to the very back, please, on the center aisle? In the center, do we have a question?
Do you
Okay.
make a relation between the zearalenone in the feed and the zearalenone in the urine? first question. And the second one is, do you know if the people use some product for the azanthic toxin?
So first part was, can we compare zearalenone in the feed and what's in the blood, or in the urine, I guess? Well, I guess you could. The correlation is not very good based on our data, and there was no association. We tested zearalenone from the feed in some of things, and it was not an as good predictor as urine. So I would probably go to urine, although, you know, from a practical point of view, it's not that easy to get. That's fine.
Okay, and I'm just going to stop the questioning there. I appreciate that we do have many more questions, and I guess it's going to make for an interesting cup of coffee afterwards. So I'd like to thank Jocelyn again and encourage you to bring your questions directly to him afterwards. Thank you very much.